Joe Biden has said some very nice things about NATO, a sacred cause. He wants to strengthen the alliance. He's recommitted the US to the defense of allies, the Article 5 clause. All of that's very good. But now, of course, we have to go beyond the polite words and decide what are going to be the concrete NATO policies. Which direction is NATO going to move in dealing with all of the new challenges? So I see Tony Blinken, the US Secretary of State's visit to NATO today, as the first step as we come to a NATO summit later this year in putting, if you like, the flesh on the bones and defining what those policies are. I think there are four quick areas to mention: the way ahead in Afghanistan, how to deal with Russia, particularly in the kind of non-conventional grey zone of what NATO calls hybrid warfare, what's NATO going to do about the challenge from China, and should NATO take up new challenges like climate change, as the Secretary General, Jens Stoltenberg, has been proposing.
It was a very helpful quick-fire analysis of what's to come, what we can look out for today. Let's just drill a little bit, if we can, on Russia and China. To what extent do you think NATO are going to be looking out at a potential alliance between Russia and China, and how might that impact how NATO works?
Well, it's quite interesting in that respect, as you say, that the Russian Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov, is actually in Beijing today and marking the 20th anniversary of a Russian-Chinese agreement. And certainly those two countries are working much more closely together. And that will concern NATO, particularly if China starts participating in large-scale Russian exercises in NATO's Western military districts, or naval maneuvers in the Mediterranean or the Baltic or the Arctic as well. Of course, we'll have to wait and see if this bromance between Moscow and Beijing is going to be a long-term affair. But it will certainly mean that NATO will have to look at Russia individually, China individually, in terms of the specific challenges that they pose, but also the increasing way that they're working together. A lot of evidence that they're working together, for example, in propaganda and disinformation campaigns, reciting each other's playbooks, and also in the area of coordinated cyber attacks, particularly in the search for information about vaccines.
You've mentioned some of the themes they're going to be looking at. When do you think we might actually have kind of concrete policy proposals?
Well, I don't think we're going to get any concrete decisions at this meeting. The Biden administration is still carrying out a lot of foreign policy reviews. Some people thought that maybe this meeting would see a decision on the way ahead in Afghanistan. Do we stay or do we go, as it were, after the May the 1st deadline for the withdrawal of the NATO troops? But as you know, Rosie, the Biden administration, particularly Secretary of State Blinken, is still working, trying to bring the Taliban into a new provisional government. So I don't think there's going to be any immediate decision there. When it comes to Russia, I think the administration will agree that NATO's done a good job with its forces in Eastern Europe of blocking the Russian conventional threat. But as I've said, the key issue is what do we do about Russia's below the radar screen activities, election interference, the cyber attacks. The US is talking about a retaliatory cyber attack against Russia. So I think the US want to drive NATO more in that direction. China, it's a big issue, and I think it's going to take a little bit more time. Does NATO go to Asia, or does it basically deal with the Chinese challenge within Europe, particularly, for example, 5G networks, investments and all of that? And finally, I think it's the NATO summit later this year, particularly in launching a new NATO strategic concept, which will decide on the alliance's future. But it's important to get the discussion on these very tricky topics underway and give NATO adequate time to come up with really sound policies.
You mentioned cyber. You know, the UK really changing its military makeup, fewer troops, but actually more technology. Are NATO going to be disappointed about that?
No, I honestly don't think so, because all of these changes mean that the UK defence budget is going up and quite significantly to 2.2% of GDP, and that's well above the NATO target of 2%. So the UK is certainly leading the way when it comes to putting its money where its mouth is, if I can use that rather brutal expression. Secondly, if you read the integrated review, and I have, it's clear that NATO and the Euro-Atlantic theatre is still the big priority for British defence planning. There's been a lot of talk about the UK shifting to Asia, and certainly they want to have a ship in Asia, they want to have a couple of aircraft in Asia, they want to be more present, but they're not shifting the bulk of their forces away from Estonia and NATO defence to Asia. Finally, you know, NATO is very concerned about the sort of things that the UK is now investing in: disruptive technologies, resilience to cyber, a greater role and resilience in the space domain. So I generally think that NATO foreign ministers will welcome where the UK is going, but there is one thing, Rosie, very important, which is that the UK is reducing numbers in exchange for giving those smaller numbers far more technology. And the smaller numbers won't work unless all of that new technology comes on stream very quickly. So I think NATO will just be interested that as this adaptation goes forward, these new sort of super tech individual forces are going to have the networking, the data, the technology that they need to do their job. The two go together, and it's like love and marriage, Rosie. You can't have one without the other.